So welcome everyone to this session. Thank you for logging in during the summer. As many of you probably already know, RISC's mission is to promote and encourage American research in the region and to foster intellectual inquiry across boundaries within the South Caucasus as well as between the South Caucasus and its neighbors. And the pandemic has greatly affected our RISC grantees' research timelines, as well as RISC programming in the South Caucasus. So the executive committee has been working with each of the grantees to revise their plans for research. But as the impacts of the pandemic on academia and research stretch onward, we feel that it is vital to have an open discussion of how research on and in the South Caucasus has been impacted, how scholars are coping and finding new creative paths to conduct research, and what research might look like in the future. The pandemic, of course, has hit at a time when American universities and international research were already facing significant challenges, and in a time when there is much discussion of education reform in the South Caucasus. So panelists may also reflect on these broader issues as well. Finally, we feel that now, perhaps more than ever, it is critical to create spaces where researchers working on the South Caucasus can connect, support each other, and share ideas. We were very encouraged to see that people registered for this event from 11 countries. And I just also wanted to share that we are already thinking of ways that RISC can support research on the South Caucasus this coming year under the continuing conditions. And so we are following up this event with a session on with librarians from several institutions on resources that are available at their institutions, and then also ones that can be accessed online or digitally. And that event is tentatively scheduled for next Friday, August 7th at the same time. And it looks like we're going to be joined by Kit Conzel from the University of Illinois, Lita Harpence from Berkeley, and possibly a couple more panelists. So if you have other ideas on how we can provide support and create more virtual spaces for connecting scholars, please feel free to reach out to us. You can email me at president@risc.org or go on our website and find multiple contact information. So we also wanted to present updates from each of the resident directors. Colleen, do you have that information?
Yes, I do. Thank you for that. In Azerbaijan, there are 30,858 COVID-19 positive cases. 430 have passed away. 23,853 have recovered. In Georgia, there are slightly increased numbers, 1,155 confirmed cases, 16 have passed, 929 have recovered. In Armenia, as of July 29, there are 37,937 confirmed cases, out of which 27,824 are confirmed recoveries, 723 have passed.
Good. Thank you, Colleen. So today we are very lucky to have moderating Dr. Kate Franklin. Am I still on mute? Okay. From the Department of History, Classics, and Archaeology at Birkbeck College, University of London. Dr. Franklin is an archaeologist of medieval Armenia and the Caucasus and co-director of the Viator Silk Road Survey. So I will now virtually pass the mic to Dr. Franklin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maureen and Colleen, for putting this together. And I'm so happy to be here. I'm looking at the participant list. And of course, like the panel, like some new colleagues, old friends. And basically, it's really nice to have this chance to like all be together in the same virtual space. Without further ado, what I'm going to do is go through and introduce each of the panelists all together. And then if you guys could, those of you who have video, just wave after I introduce you, and then we'll go into the panel after I introduce everyone. So in no particular order, our first panelist today is Laura Khatchadourian, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Cornell University. And she is both an archaeologist of Southwest Asia and a scholar of the Soviet and post-Soviet Caucasus. pursuing a longstanding concern with the materiality of empire across temporal and disciplinary boundaries, both ancient and modern, archaeological and ethnographic. Lori's most recent book, though I know she's working on another one, is Imperial Matter, Ancient Persia and the Archaeology of Empires from 2016. Our second panelist is Leah Feldman, who's assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Chicago, my former colleague. She has been exploring the poetics and politics of global literary and cultural entanglements, focusing on critical approaches to translation theory, semiotics, Marxist aesthetics, and decolonial theory, which cross between the Caucasus and Central Asia, of course. Her most recent book is On the Threshold of Eurasia, Orientalism and Revolutionary Aesthetics in the Caucasus, from 2018. Going down the line, we also have Giorgi Khelashvili, who is currently the director of the Georgian Parliament's Research Center, but has also taught at Tbilisi State University, and as well as the Center for Social Sciences in Tbilisi. He also recently served as Deputy Chief of Mission for the Georgian Embassy to the United States, and later as advisor in foreign relations to the chairman of the Georgian Parliament. His academic and professional interests include American foreign policy, democratization and nationalism, and the roles of ideas in international affairs. And currently he's working on a book on Georgian foreign policy with the provisional awesome title of Go West, Ideology in Georgia's Foreign Policy Since Independence. Our next panelist is Anna Oldfield, who is associate professor in the Department of English at Coastal Carolina University. She began her career studying Russian language and literature, and then branched out following the tentacles of the empire into the Caucasus and Central Asia. She has spent 2 years working in Azerbaijan, working with women bardic singers, and since then has continued to work in Central and Western Asia on epic, music, folklore, literature, and film. A recent book of hers is Azerbaijani Women Poet Minstrels, Women Ashiks from the 18th century to the present, out in 2008. Finally, we also have Malkhaz Toria, who is associate professor in the history department at Ilia State University. And Malkhaz's research interests, sorry, it's rush hour here in London. Research interests focus on historical discourse in medieval Georgia, memory politics, instrumentalization of the past and regional conflicts in post-Soviet Georgia, including especially the role of Russian Tsarists and Soviet imperial legacies in the creation of ethnic and cultural landscapes in Georgia, and the formation of dividing boundaries and politics of exclusion and ethnic cleansing in the breakaway region of Abkhazia. A recent publication from from Malkhaz, is Trapped in the Past, Memories of Georgian IDPs on the Margin of Society, in, I think, 2017. These are our panelists. I'm really looking forward to their commentary. So basically what we'd like to do now is give each of you a few minutes to discuss, again, challenges and opportunities that you've been grappling with since the start of the pandemic, and any thoughts you have both for the ERISC more particularly, and of course, like the broader community of Caucasus scholars. And just for the participants, if you guys could hold your questions until the end of the session. If you're worried about forgetting them, you could write them directly into the chat, and then I will read out all of the questions during the discussion section, or you can indicate that you have a question and we can unmute your microphone. So just moving right ahead, Lori, Khatchadourian, can we start with you?
Sure. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much to ERISC and to Tallinn and to Kate and Maureen for organizing this and including me in the panel. I want to begin just by acknowledging the incredible challenge that the pandemic poses to research, and simply affirm, because I think it's important to affirm that this is a very stressful time for scholars at all stages of their careers. Graduate students are concerned about dissertation research and job prospects. Early career faculty are concerned about the tenure track, and all faculty are figuring out how to teach successfully online, worried about how to move their research forward while juggling unprecedented administrative duties and meeting their students' needs. Some of us, maybe students in particular, may feel isolated. Some of us, in contrast, may be yearning for a bit of isolation if confronting the impossible challenge of working while caring for children or elderly parents. So these are real stresses, and I just think it's important to affirm that everyone is affected to some degree. If you're attending this webinar, it probably means that you hold yourself to very high standards of research. You're accustomed to working a certain way, and you want to recognize yourself as a researcher of the Caucasus in these times. So I guess before I dive into some more specific thoughts, I think that overall, the key to survival right now is to adjust our expectations somewhat, to go easy on ourselves, while at the same time moving our research forward at whatever pace is possible. So maintaining some forward movement toward our goals. As Kate mentioned, so I'm an anthropologist, both an archaeologist and an ethnographer. And so that's the perspective that I bring to bear on this conversation. These are both fields, or anthropology in general is highly dependent on fieldwork, on being there. And of course, the pandemic has put all international field projects on pause, both archaeological and ethnographic, although it is worth noting that archaeology is underway in Armenia, and I'm sure in Georgia and Azerbaijan too, just not with international teams. It can be done relatively safely since it's outdoors, social distancing is possible. So I have seen on Facebook lots of friends in the field with their masks on. So it's not totally hopeless in terms of new research, archaeological research. Ethnography is a bit more difficult because it entails or depends upon close interpersonal contact, and our relationships with our informants are premised or established through deep sociality. And so this is a real challenge. An added challenge for ethnographers of the South Caucasus is that we need to be mindful of the impact of the pandemic on our interlocutors and on our informants, and those impacts may be lasting, whether changing employment status or health conditions. So even when it will be possible to go back to the region, and obviously I'm speaking from the perspective of a US-based scholar, the context of research that we encounter may be different. So what are some opportunities that I see to continue with anthropological research at this time? Some of these may be obvious. We've all been at this now for 4 months, and so have had some time to figure things out. I guess I have 3 insights that may not be all that groundbreaking, but I do see this as a time to advance aspects of our research that do not require being there, whether that's archival work with digital collections, or reading books and journals in our fields, or language study. I have a number of graduate students in archaeology who've used this time to work on their Russian, to work on their Armenian, and I'm sure the same is true for those who are needing to learn Georgian and Azerbaijani. Second, I think this is a time to write. For those of us who are in fieldwork dependent disciplines like anthropology, summer is not usually a time to write. It's usually a time to be in the field. For students, all dissertations have chapters that do not depend on original research, whether it's literature reviews or theoretical analysis or methods sections, so progress can be made on dissertations in those areas. For anthropologists working on a book, such as myself, now might be the time to take stock of what we already have and consider how we can turn out articles with what we already have. Most of us have more data than we realize, and we can start to publish what we're working on while waiting to return to Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan to gather the data needed for a full-length monograph, if that's the case. And then finally, it's a good time to think about grant proposals, that is to gear up for when it will be possible to travel to the region again, although grants may be more competitive next year than usual, because I think a lot of people are using the summer in this way, at least anthropologists. So I would say check the programs that and the institutions that support anthropological research, NSF, Winter Grant, and of course, ARISC's grants and fellowships, to make sure they're accepting applications, but that's certainly something that one can do while waiting to be able to travel to the region again. Just a few suggested creative solutions we were asked to reflect on how to kind of get past the barriers. I do have a few ideas here that I'm happy to share. If your research project requires intensive field work, this may be the time to explore a redesign that would allow you to make use of existing sources, whether archival or secondary literature or media sources, and to rethink the scope and the parameters and even the research questions in ways that open up existing sources of data and perhaps integrate a more comparative or regional scope to the project. Archaeologists in particular are fortunate because we have troves of legacy data sets in all three countries that could be analyzed with new interpretations, already published materials, and we can aim for more synthetic studies that might bring a more regional or comparative perspective to archaeology in the South Caucasus. For ethnographic research, I have heard of some interim strategies that ethnographers are using to interact with informants through Zoom interviews. So if your interlocutors have access to technology and are comfortable with it, Zoom interviews may be a real option, as might written interviews or written surveys. I'd also suggest that now might be a time to consider hiring a research assistant in Georgia or Azerbaijan or Armenia, perhaps a student in your field of study at a university who could help you with some aspect of your project, perhaps going into archives or collections, perhaps gathering GPS points or visiting sites to take photographs and so forth. So research assistants can help move research in the region forward. And then lastly, I think now is a great time to forge or deepen partnerships with collaborators in Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia. Maybe you've wanted to add a collaborative dimension to your work, and now might be the time to identify and work with scholars from the region who have similar interests and can conduct research with you. So now is a great time to try and cultivate those kinds of relationships. Just one or two thoughts on the post-COVID future of research in anthropology in the South Caucasus. Frankly, we don't know when the post-COVID future will be. Obviously, vaccination development may take longer than we hope, and distribution will take even longer, and not all countries of the South Caucasus will arrive at the post-COVID moment at the same time. It's possible to envision, I think, a future in which archaeology and ethnography resume in the region as they did before, as they were conducted before. But it's also possible that some of the changes that we're all experimenting with could be lasting, including a more expansive sense of the evidentiary base beyond fieldwork, and perhaps a more collaborative approach. So just to conclude, I would say I think this is a marathon and not a sprint. I think we need to preserve our stamina and think as creatively as we can, and try to develop strategies that will get us through this that can be durable and positive for the future. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Lori. Next up, Lee, why don't you share your thoughts? I think you still need to unmute.
It's Talon and Maureen still. Does it work now? Thank
Yeah,
you.
you're good.
Thank you all so much for including me in this conversation. I think and Lori, thank you for those really helpful remarks. I mean, I think I'm a comparative literature scholar. And my first book is on the 1920s, but my current project is on contemporary performance art and theater. So I feel like I'm coming from a kind of humanities background, and my remarks today are sort of pointed in that direction, but also but I also do understand a little bit of the work of that anthropology and ethnographic work takes. And so, you know, as I was thinking about this question, I've been thinking more broadly about the sort of austerity measures in the humanities, and for me, the question of COVID is kind of wrapped in a larger question of what can we do to support the region and research in the humanities in the region with these increased austerity measures. At least from my institution, we're just seeing COVID as a sort of case point for a longer history in the last 5 to 10 years of cutting funding to the humanities. And I think that's obviously had a major impact on the study of minority languages and literatures in the Caucasus. So I wanted to take this opportunity to take up the ways that I think that, I have less thoughts on what we individually can do as scholars. And I wanted to take this as an awesome opportunity to dialogue with you all and a chance to sort of use this as a point for perhaps organizing futures for how we might think about working together to support research in the region more broadly. And so my remarks are kind of pointed at three different issues: rethinking the archive, rethinking the canon, and sort of making an impact in theory. So one of the things that I think would be great, and that I've drawn on, especially in the COVID moment, is trying to create infrastructure in many ways, as Lori mentioned, by creating connections with cultural institutions beyond universities, right? So connections with galleries and museums, and I've done a little bit of that work with the Osman Gallery in Almaty recently, and they've done some work in digitizing. So this is partly work in supporting, you know, in what ways can we raise support for help with digitization projects for cultural institutions, and then also to kind of broaden networks even through a risk in terms of connecting with galleries and museums as well, to try to create more networks of support so that we can kind of begin to work collaboratively. So in what ways can we kind of increase the infrastructure through a risk to support this kind of these sort of important transnational collaborations in our research? And the second point is kind of more focused on the domestic. So rethinking the canon. So one of the things that I think could be really important is sharing syllabi and trying to use the opportunity to collaboratively work to foreground research, to foreground work of the region in our core syllabi for more for core courses and the like. Some of the Slavic networks like ATSILS have done this recently. So they've just released a bunch of a group of syllabi on gender and sexuality in Russia, you know, and this makes this bank of syllabi then available for scholars. And the hope is, I guess, then that scholars might be more likely to incorporate some of this literature into their classes and incorporate, you know, kind of a broader range of literary works. And I still see that there's a lack of engagement with, even now that there's more and more works in translation by writers in the Caucasus and Central Asia, that there's still very rarely found on syllabi, even, you know, within Slavic departments. So this is one thing I think that could be helpful. It would be kind of creating a bank of syllabi to work to reorient the canon, to make it available for people so they can just sort of draw on, okay, these are sets of texts that might enrich my syllabus. And the last thing is kind of reorienting the way that we think about innovative research. So in addition to the archive, maybe thinking about ways in which we could provide both forums and also grant support for rethinking theory and rethinking history. So how can literature from the Caucasus and Central Asia contribute to theories of race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, to histories of policing and organizing, and how can we use our collective resources to reframe these disciplines, not only from the perspective of kind of drawing on our of archival research, but kind of through theoretical innovation, right? So I think a lot of the focus in the region has been on you know, archival research, which is obviously very important, especially since we're dealing with a lot of literature that hasn't been well documented, particularly in Anglophone scholarship. But we could also think about ways in which we can, the ways in which our work impacts and can reorient theoretical frameworks that and do that work in important ways, can intervene in this existing scholarship in important ways. So So I just love to see fora like this, and I think it would be great to kind of continue to have a dialogue, and I'd be very interested in continuing to have a dialogue about how we can work together to support research in the region, because I think that there's ways in which we can foreground the literature and culture of the region and make it and sort of give it an impact in contemporary scholarship in our own universities, and I'd like to support that. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Lee, so much. Those were some really thoughtful comments. Next, Anna Oldfield, could we hear from you? We had video for you. Anna, there you are, and just unmute. Awesome.
Muted? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, and it's such a privilege to be in such distinguished company, and already the discussion has been tremendously helpful. I've been taking notes here, and so I really thank Arisk and Talin and everyone who's worked to bring this together. Just to I think right in the beginning, Lori had said to remember about the problems of and the issues our interlocutors are having. I had one of the challenges I've had is that I am right now writing a lot of articles because, of course, during the semester, that stress that everybody's feeling where, having to suddenly go online, I didn't get anything done. But I found I needed a permission for Routledge. I was working with a woman who had given me Saz lessons, and we had recorded it. And I had a verbal permission. They wanted a written permission from her. And usually because she doesn't have internet, and I work with her kids, and they will help me to, connect with her and talk with her on WhatsApp, and then, send an email, but they couldn't visit her because she was having to isolate because of COVID. So we went through so much in trying to she was finally able to get me a handwritten note given to somebody else, then photographed on their phone. But it really brought it home to me in a new way, how people, what kind of issues people are having. So yeah, challenges for us and challenges for everybody. I also do work with living people, and some of the interesting opportunities that have come up have been partially because I did start working on a project of Azerbaijani women musicians in diaspora in the US. So that was that's a totally new area for me in working with the diaspora population. So that's been interesting, and it's been easier for me to do interviews and field work with them. But the good thing about that too is I have learned to use Zoom and other kind of and email and writing, different ways to do field work. Another thing that was really interesting is that there can be interesting opportunities coming on social media. I worked for years with a women's Ashik collective, Bardic singers, and they have been live streaming on Facebook. So there's actually now this kind of new collection of things that are happening on social media and on Facebook and different kind of forums that can also be a really interesting way to do field work in this kind of world, and really important ways too, ways that people are connecting with each other. For me personally, it's had me rethink my priorities a lot. I've, as we were talking about, thinking about different ways of doing research, different ways of approaching it, and I love the ideas of making and bringing together more digital collections. I think we all do digitize. I actually have a closet full of mini discs and videos and all kinds of things that need to be digitized. But one of the reasons I haven't made it a priority is, I could put them up in my university, but you want things to be somewhere where they'll do some good. So for ARISC, I'm thinking some ideas are bringing together these digital collections, making a place on the internet where people can go and look. And I also loved Leah's idea about outreach types of projects, thinking not only just for the university, but making kind of websites and resources so that so that high schools can include, say, folklore from the Caucasus or short stories, ways to outreach into local communities. This could be a really fantastic way, and part of that could be a resource website that teachers could use if they want to teach about the Caucasus. So I'm really inspired by all of your ideas. So I'm looking, I was taking notes here. Love the idea of sharing syllabi and maybe also thinking, I think we're all doing really interdisciplinary work of sharing it with other departments too, going to other departments. I started collaborating with our history department on our music department to do guest talks. So so it's great to hear from you. You've made me really inspired because I realized there's just so many things we can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. That was fantastic. Next, I'm going. I just wanted to check, Giorgi. We have sound for you. Yes.
I can hear you, and I hope you can hear too.
Awesome. I just wanted to check. Before we, I'll give you. Actually, since I have you on mic now, would you like to share your thoughts and your comments?
Sure. Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
what I'm here for, and thank you very much for the invitation and for this very thoughtful conversation, which is, besides informative part, is also an opportunity to vent what has been accumulating for the last few months. And now it's much better. It feels much better. But I guess 3 or 4 months ago, this conversation would have been much less quiet and much more emotional. At least that is my impression and experience. Even if Georgia managed to weather the COVID pandemic relatively well, at least its first stage, it took the pandemic is taking its toll on the research community. And I think my thoughts would be a bit more on the pessimistic side than optimistic, but here we are. So I have constructed my contribution along the 3 questions we received via email. So the first was about how research was affected. I guess there is not a big difference between how research was affected in Georgia or anywhere else. Mostly, also Georgian research community, especially in social sciences, is fledgling. Therefore, either there is a lot of solitary working on text, or there is a lot of exchange via seminars and conferences with sometimes not very impressive consequences. So, and these 2 types of activities are somehow, in my experience, sort of separated. They are disparate and they don't necessarily overlap each other in everyday life. Now, the lack of seminars and conferences, understandably, sort of made its negative impact on Georgian research, on all of us, because we are lacking now the stimuli for research, for exchange of ideas. That was, let's face the facts, that was normally coming from abroad, from the international community, from the United States, from European countries. And because of the lack of such conferences and seminars, then the noise, so to speak, the cacophony of research is subsiding, has considerably subsided, and the everyday sort of necessities are taking over more and more. And so our activities centered mostly on teaching, and while on the surface and initially it looked like that online teaching would be fun and easy, it didn't turn that way. And apparently this face-to-face contact, classroom contact, emotional feedback is so much more important than we ever imagined would be. And in my personal case, that was definitely the case. The second part is about challenges and opportunities, and my challenges list is a bit longer than the opportunities list. And I think the major challenge has been that the further atomization of the epistemic community in Georgia. Lack of foreign contribution, which I already mentioned, which was keeping the process alive, is dwindling, and it's difficult to keep it alive from distance, of course. Many young scholars came back from abroad just for enforced temporary leave, so to speak, PhDs and so on, who are actually keeping the process alive in Georgia. And I think that also is not a very good trend, because they are now less active and not very contributing to the domestic exchange, scientific exchange either. Normally, in my own experience, it's extremely difficult to get back on track once you have been out of practice in research. And I think that eventually that will damage the research process in Georgia, the exchange of ideas. Another fact of life is that many young researchers in Georgia in social sciences have day jobs, so to speak, and then teaching mostly is their secondary job, and then the research is relegated to the hobby level in many cases. Unfortunately, that's the case. And now, because of the everyday necessities taking over, the hobbies are somehow relegated even further down on in the ladder of priorities. But there are a couple of bright sides to it and opportunities. And the first one, I think, is that there is now more realization that research actually can be a steady activity with predictable income, and that it can actually engage you and give you more predictable opportunities for future. And in that sense, there is more reliance, I think, and more activity to look for European funding. As you know, we are associated members of the European Union, so to speak, and then we have access to some European research money. But Georgian research community is probably tapping probably very, very little of that funding opportunity from Europe. And now with with the challenge of the pandemic, I think that there is a growing realization that it is much more appropriate, much more dependable to join into this, to tap in this European resource. And therefore, the second point is a broader point. I think pandemic will eventually push Georgian research community towards more internationalization. We have been quite open to international experience, but I think this situation is pushing that even further, which is actually a good thing. Now, the creative solutions, if we can think of any. I think there was the pandemic, at least in my field, which is international relations. It put everything upside down. And that is very visible in our research community and also professional community as well. To give you an example of what we call the new security challenges, which is sort of global warming and the international pandemics, and then all the transnational security threats. challenges have been usually relegated to the second stage. And the main stage in our field was interstate relations, traditional power politics, geopolitics, conflicts, great power competition, and so on and so on. And suddenly it turned out that everything is, you cannot tackle it with traditional means. I mean, the greatest challenge which touched each of us. So what I noticed was a very interesting thing that I usually teach at the university research design to the bachelor's level students. So I teach them how to write their bachelor's theses, basically. And this year, when I was sort of advising them how to construct their cases, and I was collecting their design ideas, I noticed that disproportionately larger number was about these non-traditional international relations stuff, so to speak. Not so much power politics anymore, but about the environment, soft sort of the influence of ideas, transnational threats, and so on and so on. So in that sense, I think the more creative approach to research can be in the making, because this pandemic actually made all of us stop, maybe just international relations specific, and pause and rethink where we live and how all this can affect our future. So in that sense, that was a surprisingly sobering moment for the international relations and foreign policy community in Georgia. And then what I also noticed, which is corollary to the last point, is that in the discussions that are nonetheless dwindling but still going on in our research circles, there are the new ideas coming up, sort of the new approaches. It's not so much anymore about writing, because sometimes it was impossible to either do field work or write. So there was more energetic exchange of sometimes crazy ideas in our field, which for me was somewhat reminiscent of the late 90s and early 2000s, when we had these big clashes of ideologies and ideas and so on and so on. So I think pandemic made us somewhat pushed out of the routine. And that pushing out can be damaging for the field and the epistemic community in the short term, but in the longer term, it can be actually quite maybe positive. But that remains to be seen, as one of the contributors said. I think it was Maureen, this is, or maybe Laurie, I think it is, we are bracing for a long-term challenge rather than a short-term problem. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Malkhaz, would you please do the honor of bringing the comments to a close? Thank you for waiting. Thanks.
Thank you. So I heard so many interesting and multifaceted description and the problems and also solutions connected with this global pandemic, but I will try to bring some ideas, and actually I can provide a kind of a combination of perspectives, both as a professor of history, more than 10 years of teaching or researching, and also recently enrolled in a sociology graduate student at the New School for Social Research. So I can have the both teachers, instructors, and students' perspective on this problem. And I was in New York City for the spring semester, and we were not fully convinced about the possibility of a coronavirus outbreak until it really happened. And only then I had to sort of catch up one of the last planes to Georgia. So yeah, this is some sort of personal touch of this problem. But as to how the research in my discipline, like in history, for instance, was affected, me and my colleagues were facing also many challenges. For instance, I'm a principal investigator of two research projects, international and domestic, and we had a really complex agenda, like, and plans, including administration, and of course, many of our plans changed naturally. So like meetings, workshops, presenting the work in progress results in Ukraine, for instance, or in Georgia at various institutions. So we had the plans to do archival work, some library works, of course. Now everything is closed in Georgia, for instance, even though the situation is much improved than it was during the lockdown. And we don't know when these archives will be open and libraries, So in terms of fieldwork, it was more manageable because the Zoom was quite helpful in that sense, and we managed to cope with this problem. And publications also was somehow affected because the deadline, we had to ask to postpone the deadline for submission, and the academic journals themselves also had to delay this peer review process. So everything, the whole process for repertoire of these issues were affected. In terms of teaching, for instance, the face-to-face meeting, of course, is a very important aspect of teaching or studying. And of course, I think there's resuming normal on-campus teaching or studying would be the best solution, but given the ongoing situation, it's non-starter, especially for the fall semester. This is also kind of challenging because international students many of them had to leave United States, for instance, and they live in different time zones. There might be some technical difficulties with connections, or even worse, like some countries can monitor the internet or their connections. The COVID-19 exposed the different challenges which is connected with the political regimes or geopolitics. But let's start to the more optimistic kind of perspective, more creative solutions. I think even this situation might bring some sort of this unusual format, can present some creative way of teaching or studying, like an asynchronous or synchronous kind of components in teaching, like using the online platform. Of course, this digitalizing of this literature or sources also very important. It should be, of course, carried additionally, even in our time, because the online format was not new, of course, before the pandemic. What is more important in conceptual way, in conceptual level, the COVID-19, this coronavirus pandemic, posed many issues like research problems, which was not really central before that. It exposed many problems which was already existent, but equality issues, geopolitics, and in the Caucasus, it's particularly important because in Georgian case, even conflict kind of zones and these conflicted breakaway regions are sometimes used as a tool for political propaganda, this American labs in Tbilisi is used in, for instance, Russian propaganda as a tool to affect on Georgian government or disinform their public that in Georgia this lab creates some kind of viruses or works on the interest of USA, etc. So this pandemic exposed old problems in a new light. Yeah, and of course this problem will be addressed in various formats, like in the conferences, meetings, initially via Zoom or WebEx, or then hopefully face-to-face meeting formats, like we are planning to have international conference on memories in dark times, for instance, like which is really topical issues. So that was sort of my brief kind of key points, what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you guys, for giving us so much to think about and some real food for thought